When it comes to the supernatural, I've always been a bit on the fence about whether I believe in it fully or not, as an alternative explanation for strange or eerie things happening in life. Firstly, I should mention, this is not my story. It is actually my mother's story, but definitely one of those stories I grew up listening to as a child, along with my own experiences, had me believe that perhaps supernatural forces are a thing. I gotta be honest though, stories like this would scare the shit out of me, especially being such a hypersensitive and an overthinker, not always at the most helpful moments. So, I'd often think it would be so much more, let's say, a more comfortable existence to be a non-believer, because it can be very fucking inconvenient and often debilitating being afraid. Whether it's those heart-thumping moments of being in a dark space, searching frantically for the light switch, when there hasn't actually been any trigger to create that fear, merely the unknown darkness itself. To give a bit of background, my mother is Japanese, but I grew up in Australia, taking annual trips when possible to Japan with her to stay in touch with that side of my heritage, as well as seeing friends and relatives. Over post-dinner drinks with my mother one evening, she told me this story. During one of many trips to Japan she had taken by herself, the usual flow of her trips would go a little something like this: hang out with family in Osaka for a bit, then head off to Tokyo, Chiba, and Iwate for some time to visit longtime friends before returning to Osaka for the last part before returning to Australia. One of her longtime friends lives in Chiba. We'll call her Yuri for privacy reasons, whom, at the time, had a pretty hectic life. Both she and her husband worked full-time jobs whilst raising her two little sons, as well as her troublemaker of an eldest teenage son. So, whenever my mother visited, it was typical for her to of course chat and hang out where possible, but knowing how busy Yuri was, she would always lend a hand and do whatever she could. On one particular early evening, Yuri asked my mother to take her dog for a walk before dinner time. My mother, just as my father and I would be too, happy to do something like that, as we're an adventurous sort of family, always up for being out and about exploring. As she gave my mother the essentials for walking the dog, leash, etc., and a suggested interesting route to take, my mother was startled by Yuri's sudden firm tone in her voice. "Whatever you do, especially at this time of night, stay on the path and don't go through this old shrine, which might seem like a shortcut." Being more of a believer in supernatural and spiritual in general, my mother appreciated Yuri's advice, but also, being quite a strong and independent sort, eagerly left the house with the dog for their walk. As they got walking, being winter, it got dark pretty quickly. There were street lights, the lights from cute little artisan shops guiding the way, and some people about. So it was a charming, fresh walk out in the cool night air. As mentioned, our family have always been quite an active, exploratory bunch. So you may be able to imagine, with the excitement of seeing new things whilst on holiday, with a very enthusiastic dog pulling her along. Yes, you guessed it. She somehow veered off the path for some distance before she realized the friendliness of the guiding streetlights had gone. Finding herself in a shrine, dimly lit by lanterns. The dog seemed to suddenly become more alert and less mission-oriented as it was back on the lit main path. This definitely startled my mother, as she suddenly became aware that perhaps she may have strayed off the path and ended up at that old shrine Yuri had warned her about. As her eyes adjusted more to the lower light, she was suddenly filled with dread as she saw dozens of straw dolls brutally nailed to trees using crude iron spikes with messages attached to them. She immediately knew what they were. They were, in fact, waraningyo, dolls which can be used as a Japanese form of voodoo, dark rituals to put curses or, even worse, wish for the death or other terrible things to inflict on your enemy. Being a curious cat, my mother couldn't help but step closer to see what one of the messages read. "I hope you die soon," scrawled in messy calligraphic ink Japanese characters. Heart racing, my mother found her way out of the old shrine, finally back onto the familiar comfort of the lit path, back to Yuri's house. The story doesn't end here. Probably the part that makes it scarier is when she arrived back at Yuri's front door. She rang the doorbell. What was odd is that Yuri took a bit of time to open the door, and when she did, she suspiciously opened it just a crack, enough to just peep through. Even though she knew it was my mother, assuming she would have used the peephole before opening the door, and generally expecting her back at that time, before my mother could say anything, still what felt like it was from the safety of behind the door, Yuri spoke in an alarmingly lower, concerned tone. "You went there, didn't you?" I don't... What makes you say that? I mean, how did you know?" my mother stammered. Yuri looked suspiciously left and right behind my mother, as if checking if someone else might be there. My mother followed Yuri's gaze, puzzled why she might be looking in that direction. Yuri looked at my mother, then around her, then back to her face again, then finally saying, "Because you brought one back with you." "What? Where?" my mother said, starting to get afraid. It was then that she started to smell and see smoke from incense coming through the crack in the door. "It's right there. It's on you. That's why I lit incense for you before you came back, because I knew you had gone to that old shrine." My mother was lost for words. Yuri chanted, "Namu Amida Butsu, Namu Amida Butsu, Namu Amida Butsu," a few times, a sacred Buddhist protection prayer. "Anyway, just come inside. It's time for dinner," said Yuri, finally opening the door fully to let my mother and her dog inside. That night, after a comforting winter dinner with Yuri and her family, my mother felt better and things seemed no longer tense. The creepy vibes seemed to have vanished. Nothing a good hearty meal with good conversation and a few beers can't fix. As usual, Yuri had set up my mother's futon bed in the tatami guest room. Thanking Yuri for the wonderful dinner and apologizing for any discomfort earlier after returning from her walk, my mother wished Yuri good night as she closed the sliding doors behind her, leaving my mother alone with a bedside lamp on for her pre-bedtime reading ritual to help her sleep. However, with each page, she felt a creeping sense of darkness come over her. Not literally. It was a feeling. Usually able to sleep quite soon after a big meal, and not easily fazed, it started to really bother her. No matter what she did, she just couldn't seem to get to sleep. Some hours passed, 1 a.m., then 2 a.m. Suddenly, the screen door in her room slid open, and there was Yuri. "You can't sleep, right?" she said in a sleepy, soft whisper. "Yeah, that's right," my mother whispered back. "Yes, I thought so," said Yuri. "Wait a moment." She shuffled around in another room and returned with a bowl of salt, then started sprinkling a circle of it around my mother's bed. Fully trusting what was happening, my mother just watched in silence. "There," said Yuri as she dusted off her hands, finishing the circle. "Now you should be able to sleep. They can't get to you now. Good night. See you in the morning." And with that, my mother fell asleep moments after Yuri left her alone. Thank you for listening. I do hope you enjoyed the story, folks. It is the first of hopefully many more to come to the Between Worlds channel. I'll be covering both true and fictional stories, from the scary to travel and many other genres. Having said that, I'd love to hear from you with your comments, feedback, and/or submit one of your stories, and I'll narrate them for you. And don't forget to give it a like and subscribe if you like what you heard. Once again, thanks for listening. This is Boa from Between Worlds, signing off.